Have a look at what is grabbing headlines here in France now, though. Many papers devoting their front pages, of course, to that New Year's Eve massacre in Istanbul, aren't they, Alison?
They are. That attack capped off a very violent year in Turkey, a cycle of violence, as the Figaro calls it. The paper notes that over 400 people have been killed in a wave of attacks since 2015. These attacks have mostly all been claimed by Kurdish militants or by the Islamic State group, but so far no group has come forward to claim this weekend's attack, and the shooter is still on the run.
Yeah, as you say, that attack not claimed. The security experts, though, in the French press seem to be saying it has all those hallmarks of the Islamic State group here.
Yeah, one researcher who spoke to the Libération said that it has all of the elements: the target, it was a popular nightclub; the mode of the attack, that it was a shooting, and that it also came at a symbolic date, New Year's Eve, leads to the conclusion that it was the Islamic State group. In its headline, you can see there, the Libé also points to the sheer amount of violence Turkey has seen. Nouvel an, nouveau massacre, new year, new massacre. Libération also says that the attack was facilitated by gaps in Turkish intelligence, which is a result of the purges, according to Libé, that President Erdogan has been carrying out since the failed coup. And according to the paper, 90% of the Turkish Interior Ministry's intelligence service had been fired.
And Libération is also citing another expert as well, very strongly pointing the finger at Erdogan himself, saying he waited just too long to start this fight against the Islamic State group.
Yeah, this is in an interview with a French researcher who's been living in Turkey for about 17 years now. He says that Erdogan didn't launch an open war, what he calls an open war, against the Islamic State group until this past August, when they sent soldiers onto the ground in Syria. And for this researcher, that was just waiting far too long. He also says that the failed coup traumatized Erdogan and that he hasn't since then been able to create a hierarchy of all the threats that he feels like he's been facing. And so that according to this researcher, the Turkish government has sort of put the opposition, journalists, politicians, academics, all on the same level, and as its armed enemies, and that's making Turkey's fight against terrorism, quote, hard to read and also not very effective.
Okay. Well, let's move on to a completely different story now, getting a lot of attention here in the French press today. This is the opening of a landmark corruption trial targeting the son of Equatorial Guinea's president.
Yes, that's Teodorin Obiang. He's the son of Equatorial Guinea's president. He's also the country's vice president. He's accused of money laundering and corruption. According to La Croix, the trial is a first in France against a foreign leader who has taken public resources from a poor country, and in this case, a poor African country, and used them for their own good. In this case, Teodorin Obiang used the nation's oil money to make some quite luxurious purchases here in France. Notably, the article talks about his swanky apartment in Paris that includes a hammam and a discotheque.
Okay, discotheque in an apartment. Okay. Now, the French papers are also talking about President FrancoisHollande. We'll tell you in the news he's arrived in Iraq. But before then, he made his New Year wishes to the country, didn't he?
Yeah, this was his last New Year's address of his presidency. And the Figaro notes that these vows were pretty somber and painted what the paper calls a catastrophic picture of the international political landscape. The speech also included a lot of warnings, notably against the rise of the far-right National Front.
And speaking of the National Front, its leader, Marine Le Pen, found a way to fund her presidential campaign. She's asked Dad, apparently.
She has. With banks refusing to lend money to the National Front, Marine Le Pen had been struggling to raise money for her presidential campaign. And according to the pro-business paper L'Opinion, she decided to ask her dad, or more specifically her dad's company, Cotelec. The paper says, with nowhere else to turn, Marine Le Pen borrows $6 million from the, quote, bank that is her dad. Opinion finds this quite funny. The paper reminds us that she's borrowing money from her dad, who she kicked out of the party in 2015 and who she can't have contact with, actually, without the presence of a lawyer. So the paper imagines that Jean-Marie Le Pen must love that his daughter has to come back to eat out of his hand after she's just showed him the door.
I assume he knows about it. Who knows? Now, then, finally, 2017 ushers in some new laws here in France. There is one law that is getting particular attention, isn't there?
Yes, and that is the right to disconnect. This measure is part of the new labor law, which is called the Law El Khomri, after the labor minister. It gives French workers the right to respond to, not to respond to work emails over the weekend and after 6 p.m. And it's a law that already exists in many other countries, at least on paper, but it's hard to imagine it working in certain work settings. I'm not sure if those of us at France 24...
No, exactly. What about 7 o'clock in the morning?
I know, right? I'd like to benefit, but...
Perhaps not. All right, thank you very much, Alison. Alison, you can disconnect for a little while.
All right, thanks, Stuart.
You'll be back in a couple of hours, won't she, with the French paper review. Oh, sorry, with the international paper review. Thanks. Now,